Hello, welcome back. So let's look at relational databases in RDF. A lot of data nowadays is stored in relational databases. So it would not really be efficient to try to replace or manually change all of this data into RDF format. Rather, what you're interested in is taking the data that you have in very well working, mature, stable relational databases and make it available somehow in RDF format, for example, as a node in the linked Open Data Cloud. So what we want to do is we want to export the relational data into a graph form. Export doesn't mean that we kind of have a data dump. That is possible. That is one technique. You could export the whole data and then have a sort of a duplicated version in RDF. But for very large data sets that you want to have up to date, that would just be very expensive to keep these two data sets at the same time. Rather, what people do is to have kind of a bridge between the SQL vault, the relational vault, and the graph vault, the RDF vault. And you'll see that all the major providers of relational databases have some way of connecting to a graph data format. So for relational databases, there are different ways of doing this. And here I'm just going to mention one of them, which is called R2RML. So this is a way to convert relational data to an RDF graph data model. The way it works is first you need to have a relational database schema that describes the tables and the entries in the tables. Then you need a separate R2RML instance. So this is a description that explains how to translate the relational schema into a graph. And then the third thing you need is the actual data, the tables with the actual content. And then you feed all of this into a R2RML processor. And what it will do is generate an RDF graph out of it. And we have sort of seen this when I showed you this bookstore example. Remember, I said, okay, there is an online web store and they have a relational database. And then magically, we made this into a graph. For the bookstore here, we have the book with an author, title, publisher, and then a separate table for the author with a homepage. And the graph we created out of it looked like this. We have the ISBN translated into a URI with title and year as properties, and then the author using a blank note into a name and homepage. So this is what our processing should be able to do. It should be able to take an entry from one table, create the first part of the graph out of it, then take the second table, create the second part of the graph out of it, and then has to be able to look at this, what in relational databases is called a foreign key relationship, this link between the two tables, and translate it into a property link between these two subgraphs. How does this work? I'm not going to give you a full tutorial on R2RMF because that would take pretty much a whole lecture. But essentially what you have is another description in RDF that provides the translation from one format into the other. So you have this schema, this description on how to do the mapping. And in this case, we have the first mapping for the person. So it starts from the person table and then explains how to map the entries for the person table. And this is what makes the mapping down here. Similarly, you have an entry for the book table. So it takes the table here and then explains how to map the different entries in the table into the RDF graph. And then finally, you have a third mapping description that explains how to translate this foreign key relationship from parent to child using this author relationship. And then you run all of this to the R2RML processor, and you can now query the graph, and internally it will map it in real time into queries onto the relational database. So for this, we are not really doing any lab exercises. It might be helpful for you if you use a relational database in your project. I'm going to link another tutorial on this online. But yeah, basically this is for you to know if you work on a real world project. Very often there are relational databases involved, and then you are aware on where to look and how to use this kind of mapping. So in the next part, the last part for this section, I will tell you a bit about how to design a knowledge graph for an application. See you then.